Day by day, little by little, we write the story of our lives. Join author Joe Alch on a walk down memory lane with tenacious humans who didn't let their circumstances dictate their life and what they could become. Welcome to the Lemon Tree Memoirs of Courage podcast.
Hi, good afternoon. We're here for Lemon Tree number 3. We're talking about my book, my memoir about courage. And I've got Chris Ashaki here who is interviewing me and asking me questions about my book. And so I'm just going to let you get started.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity. And where I want to start today is where we left off last time was right before where in the book where you met your husband, Matt. Mm-hmm. So tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I was always attracted to the blue-eyed blondes, the Robert Redford type. You wouldn't know Robert Redford. He's a little bit
I know Robert
older
Redford.
than you are.
He's handsome.
So anyway, I was always interested in that type, and I wondered, why was I interested in that type? But I lived right by Tulane, a university, right by fraternity houses, and I think I was just automatically attracted to that preppy boy, that clean-cut preppy boy. We didn't have any of those in Slidell. So when I went to LSU, I was at my sorority formal, and I saw him on the dance floor dancing with one of my sorority sisters, and I knew they were just friends. I knew her pretty well, and I remember saying to my friend Dottie, "Who is that guy? That is who I'm going to marry." He was so cute. He was dancing and smiling and just looked like the life of the party. He was having fun. And but the problem was I had gained the freshman 20, not just the 10, but the 20. I had been eating so sporadically and unhealthy. And, as a teenager, I didn't have any guidance on what to eat, what not to eat when my clothes were feeling tight. And so I got a little spoiled in the school cafeteria. So when I met him, I decided, you know what? I'm starting my diet on Monday, and I am on a mission to meet this guy. So about 3 months later, I was at Pat O'Brien's famous bar in New Orleans for what's called a hurricane. It's a punch drink full of alcohol, full of rum. And they came in glasses about this tall. But back in the days, in the 70s and 80s, they had what was called a magnum, and the glass was about this tall, and the straws were huge, like those pixie straws, and 20 or 30 people would gather around and drink out of these magnums. Well, I see a group of very cute fraternity boys drinking out of magnum, and there he is. There's Matt. I still hadn't lost quite the 20 of my freshman 20. I may have lost 10. But I did have the courage to go up and meet him and talk to him. And we wound up spending 3 or 4 hours that night. Pat O'Brien stayed open till, I don't think it ever closes, or stays open till 7 in the morning, something like that. So we talked for several hours, and it was like I just met my true love. I just knew it then. So I went home, went on a mission, continued my diet journey. Had my tonsils out, which is a sure way when you're 19 to lose weight. Got back to school and saw him at school the second or third day that I was back at school, and we started dating, and we were inseparable. And he was just a best friend. He was my soulmate, love of my life, and we just connected. He got me, I got him, and it was awesome.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
So I know that there was a point in the book where you had said that you had moved to New York to kind of to try to figure out your fashion career, and that you wanted to do that. That was long before, a little while before you decided that you were called to nursing. So tell me about that experience. How was New York for you?
New York was fabulous. And let me just back up. Matt and I were dating. We were so close. But I did not want to stay in Louisiana. I knew I did not have a future in Louisiana. There was so much dark and so many bad memories, that I wanted a new start. My junior year in high school, I went on a trip to New York City.
That's right.
With our drama club. There were 12 of us that went. We raised the money to go. And it was just an experience of a lifetime. But it was a city I always wanted to live in. So I decided to go for the summer. It was the summer after my senior year. I hadn't quite graduated from LSU. So I decided I'd go for the summer. And I loved it so much, I stayed for 2 years. So it was a great experience. I got a job in fashion. And I learned a lesson when I got there that I had an uncle, a very sweet uncle, who took me to dinner and asked me, what are the 10 companies you want to work for? I just gotten there. I didn't know anybody, didn't know a soul. And so he said, write those names down. So I wrote down the names of the companies I most wanted to work for. And he said, okay, in the morning, you pick up the phone and call them and see if they're hiring. And I was like, well, I can't do that. These are the top fashion designers. But he was right. I made a call and I got a job. It was I think it was God, I really do, but there was an opening, an entry-level position open at Albert & Napon, who was at that day, in that time, one of the top designers in the country.
Wow.
And I got a job, and by the first week, I could only wear their couture clothes, and they provided the clothes for me, and it was amazing. It was a dream come true job.
How fabulous.
It was fun.
So you moved back after the 2 years. You missed Louisiana. You kind of doing what you did in New York was kind of met your need of getting there and living there and experiencing that. And so you came back.
Right. I moved to Dallas.
You moved to Dallas.
I moved to Dallas. And so I was up there for 2 years. And as wonderful as the clothes were, Matt and I were dating long distance again. And he knew he never wanted to live in Manhattan. It was just too big for him. I didn't want to go back to Louisiana. So Honey and Bear, my grandparents lived in Dallas, and I always loved Dallas. So I thought that was a good, happy medium that, if we were going to make things work, I just couldn't go back to Louisiana. There were too many bad memories. But Dallas was metropolitan. It was one state over from Matt's family. He was very close with his family. And so I moved to Dallas, and then about 3 months later, Matt moved to Dallas.
Yay!
Yeah.
So during that time that you were in Manhattan, there was still family stuff going on, and there was something that happened with your stepfather's youngest son. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I write about it in the book. And when my mother left us, she left 3 children. Henry, the dentist that she fell in love with, left his family too. So there were 6 of us. We were never asked or put in the same room together. Henry and my mother felt like that was a different life. And so we never had an opportunity to all 6 be together and get to know each other. But I did get to know Paul. He was the youngest. He was put in a boarding school not too long after Henry and my mother got married. Paul was put in a boarding school. It was where Henry went to high school. And he was in his junior year, and he was very lonesome. And I remember I would say to my mother, do you all go up and visit Paul? Do you, the boarding school was 20 minutes away from Slidell. And Paul was pretty much by himself. So some weekends he'd call him and say, can I come stay with you for a weekend? And they'd pick him up and he'd stay with them for the weekend. But it was always at his initiative. They never made the initiative, hey, Paul, let's get together this weekend. What's going on at school? Is there a football game? And I had so many conversations with my mother about, you need to make an effort. You need to, he's in high school. He's in a boarding school, how many kids want that? And you need to make the effort. And my mother would say, I know. But one particular weekend, he was coming in for the weekend, and everything was fun. The night they picked him up from school, they went to dinner, went home. The next day, my mother and Henry kind of made their plans, did their own thing, and both got home in the afternoon. Paul was watching movies on TV, and Henry asked him, hey, Martha and I are going to dinner. Do you want to join us? And Paul said, no, I'm good. I'm going to stay in for the night. Which, looking back, why would even ask, do you want to join us? That tells me, do you want to come with us? Not, what are we going to all do while you're here? So they went out to dinner, came home. When they got back home, all the lights were on. The TV was blaring, and they called out his name. My mother walked into the kitchen, didn't see him. He wasn't in the living room. He wasn't in the TV room. So they walked into their bedroom, and they noticed that Paul was asleep. He was dressed in a suit. His hair was perfectly styled. And Henry noticed that he was sleeping. So Henry went over to wake him up. And when he did that, he noticed a gun in his hand. And Paul had committed suicide on their bed with no note. And it was devastating for my mother and Henry. We got a call the next day. It was a horrible night for them. And long story short, for about 2 weeks, my mother and Henry would call me every day. They would call my brother and sister and the other surviving children and talk about how much they loved us and how much a part of our life there was, and how much, they wanted to be a family. So for about 2 weeks, I had hope. You know what? It's going to take a tragedy like a death for them to see how important family is. And it gave me a hope that, you know what, we're going to be a family again. And about 2 weeks later, they were all right back into their old routine, never called, kind of went back into their typical Monday through Friday weekends. Nobody knew where they were, and they slipped right back into their old patterns. And I really thought that they would learn a valuable lesson about this, and do a little soul searching, and they didn't. They, it was very sad. It was a very sad time for all of us.
Well, and how did it personally affect you? Just along, you were out of the state.
I was in New York City. I couldn't afford to fly home. But number one, I wanted to be there for my mother. I know finding someone that had taken their life would have to be so traumatic. I wanted to be there for her, and I wanted to be there for Henry too. And my heart broke for Paul's natural siblings, what they were going through, what his mother was going through. It had to have been horrible, And
you couldn't reach out because you didn't know them.
I didn't know them. I couldn't reach out. I wouldn't have had their phone number. It just wasn't, I didn't speak to the other siblings. So where we could have all really united and grieved together and mourned together, there wasn't that opportunity. My brother was the only one that was there at the time that actually went to the funeral. And, it's just something I wish we had been there. But the one thing, when that all happened, suicide, as much as we went through, it was never an option, and it's never the right answer. But I could have so easily, with Paul committing suicide, any of us could have fit in that, slipped into that category. And, thank God we didn't. Thank God we had the strength to persevere. And I just wish Paul had some kind of a lemon tree to grab hold of.
Yeah. Whether it was his faith or the place, the actual location, like you had the lemon tree. It's just knowing, and like you said, looking back on it, you knew he was kind of secluded a little bit and felt lonely, and, but unless the parents, just looking at this, they should have, in retrospect, it would have just helped 1,000% if they would have made some kind of effort, and not blaming anybody or blaming parents, but just knowing that, those kind of things, especially when you feel secluded and you feel like you're lonely, to reach out and get help. And it's easier said than done, because I myself have had those thoughts before, and I've been there, so I understand that. But it's just, I just really wanted to know exactly how it affected you and your siblings too. I mean, aside, we know it was horrible for his natural siblings, like you said, but because you weren't allowed to know them. And I know we'll talk about kind of getting, if you had the opportunity to know them later, those kind of things in a later on. But so that was kind of a turning point, I think, where you kind of it sealed in your mind, okay, I really thought this was gonna, this tragedy was gonna
and I needed that relationship with my mother so bad, and I reached for something that wasn't there. I kept holding on to a hope that we would have something that she was not capable of giving. But I would have conversations with her, and it was never about her and me, but I would have conversations about Paul and say, I can see where his dad was 20 minutes away, and while he's sitting in his dorm room studying by himself, his dad could pick up the phone or could just drive up and they could have an ice cream cone or go have a Slurpee or go have a cup of coffee, something. And I knew what that felt like. And so my heart broke for him because I knew what he was feeling. And
by you saying that to her about Paul, it was also a reflection of you and your siblings as well. I mean, and having to say that to her about a step sibling, when I know so desperately, it's like, me,
look
like
in the
us.
mirror. Do you not see this? But she wasn't capable. And I think my mother had in her mind, she had that narcissistic personality that she was perfect. She could not go there to say, wow, that is similar to you and Hope and Gilly. She wasn't capable of doing that. And I think for so long, I wanted a light bulb to go off and say, wow, I have made such a mistake.
Yeah.
And she was never capable of doing that.
Yeah. And I know that in the healing process and in writing the book, coming to know that that's how she was and that's what it was, and she wasn't capable. And so all part of that healing process. So I want to get back to you and Matt because I love this part. So when you went back to Dallas and you and Matt are dating, so tell me about when you guys got married and then started having kids.
Okay. So I moved to Dallas, and about 3 months later, he called me about 2 a.m. and he goes, guess where I am? And I said, where are you? And he said, I'm in Dallas. I just moved here. And I was like, what? So he just surprised me. He didn't tell me he was planning it. He came to Dallas without a job, so he knew he'd find something. And so we started dating again, and the next year we got married. And it was soon after that, not long after that, maybe a couple of years, I worked. And anyway, we had Amanda, our first child. And so we had a great marriage, beginning of our marriage. And he's just a great guy, great dad. And what I love about Matt is I needed a guy that just kind of saw me and knew me for who I was. There were no pretenses. What you see is what you get, and he's the same. And I think that's why we get along so well, as we understand each other, our faults, our strengths, and we just encourage each other.
When he loved you unconditionally from the beginning, and you can still see that because y'all have been married how many years?
Almost 32 years.
Which is amazing in itself. And the fact that, I see y'all every day. I have the blessing to see y'all every day. And it's just, everybody every marriage has their stuff, but y'all genuinely just love each other, and you're best friends. And that's what's so cool is that you have that, and you've grown together through all of the stuff and through the healing and through just, I'm sure, family stuff he's had, just all these, just life stuff. And you've stuck together because your foundation is on the Lord, but you rely on each other, and you're best friends. And it's so encouraging for someone like me who, my parents are not together anymore, and that's a whole other thing, but it doesn't, neither here nor there, but it's encouraging because I get to see just the joy that y'all have together, and it's just wonderful to be able to see. So just know it's noticed, it's an encouragement. So when you had Amanda, and then when was it exactly that you felt your calling to become a nurse?
Well, in 7th grade, I took a test, an aptitude test, and it determined kind of what was the best career path. Mine said I'd be a great nurse. And I was like, there is no way I could be a nurse. That just doesn't seem like something that would suit me. Because I'd done a lot of visits at the home for the incurables and done a lot of service work, and I was trying to be a kid. And anyway, well, my grandmother, I'd had Amanda, and she was only about a month old, and my grandmother, Honey, had a heart attack, and she was at Baylor Hospital. She had to have a quadruple bypass, and when she was in recovery, there was a student nurse from the community college here, El Centro College, who was assigned to her and was with us the entire day. So she was with my grandmother, with me, and Amanda. I had Amanda in her little baby carrier. And the student nurse told me all about the program. And it was as if God tapped on my shoulder and said, you know what? I can use you here. And so the next week, I went and looked into a program, signed up for classes, and started anatomy the following semester. So I started in January.
I love that. So you were a nurse. I know you were a hospice nurse. How long were you a working active nurse before you decided, I think it's time to have a business? Like, what did that look like?
And that's, everything. And despite my struggles, I always have had a strong faith, and I've known God was there, and I kind of look for signs and listen for signs, and He does leave signs. He does give you signs, and if you ask, He's going to answer. It may not be the answer you want, but every semester in nursing school, my instructors would tell me, you would be a really good hospice nurse. So I wound up, when I graduated, working at Parkland, which is the big county hospital here in Dallas. And it was the busiest, hardest job. I should have had roller skates to be on that floor, going back and forth. I was so busy. So one day I was super discouraged. I went home, opened the phone book to hospices, and started making phone calls, kind of like what I did back in New York. And a company, Family Hospice, kind of stood out on the page. It was in bold italics, and the rest were just regular. So I gave them a call. They were interviewing, and so I went in, and they hired me as a part-time position. I didn't have enough experience, but hired me part-time. I immediately loved doing hospice.
Oh, wow.
And then I was probably on the job about a month and a half, and a full-time position opened up. So I started doing hospice full-time. I would meet with families and tell them about hospice care. I kind of did admissions. I did that for a long time and met with families. And what most people don't understand, they think that hospice means somebody's with you around the clock for 6 months. And it's not the case. We've had choir members that have been on hospice, and you really have to have that additional support from family or friends or an agency or whatever. Because you're like a baby. You need somebody around the clock with you.
Absolutely.
And so I had families ask me, well, I thought Medicare would pay for somebody to be with me around the clock, or my dad. And I'd say, no, it's not paid for by Medicare. It's private pay. So the handful of companies I did recommend, private caregivers for, never once did I get a thank you. So I was churning. My brain was churning, and thought, I would love to do this. So I approached my boss about it. This was at a different hospice, and I said, I kind of think it'd be neat to have an agency that really understood hospice, but more private pay. And my boss at the time told me, Jo, you know nothing about business. You're going to fall flat on your face.
Oh, my word.
I was like, okay, well, let me think then. But something kept stirring inside me, Jo, you can do this, you can do this. So I was out in LA with my daughter, Amanda. She's an actress. And I'll never forget, I was sitting in a church service, and the movie The Passion of the Christ had just come out, and they were doing a video on the movie. It was incredible. And then somebody was singing a song alongside it. It was the most beautiful woman's voice, gospel. And it was as if God said, it's time. You do it. I got you. You do this, and I'll see you through it. So I started my agency, still working part-time, and
Out of your house, correct?
out of my house, started out of my house. And now, 13 years later, we have 385 employees and still growing. And it's just amazing. And it's amazing. It keeps
totally
growing.
God.
It is. It is.
I mean,
It is.
just seeing the blessing that he's had on your life since the beginning and all of those times through all of the things that happen, your parents, just all the epic disappointments and the constant feeling like you're invisible. You always knew, no matter what the circumstances were, that the Lord was with you. You always knew that, because He did give you signs. He gave you the lemon tree. He gave you some friends that had parents that were so wonderful to you and would get you Easter dresses or would help make dresses for you too, along with your best friends. And I mean, just all these little nurturing things that the Lord gave you to just show you that you were in His hand. And in starting the business was the exact same thing. I mean, it was such a blessing.
Well, and we talked about this, but I do feel we can all be a lemon tree. We can always be support, and we can always give a hand, whether it be just pray for that person or give them a compliment or, hey, can I pay for your coffee today? There's always a way you can be a light for someone. You never know what that person you're standing next to in line is going through.
Never.
And then, just for me, I think with trauma, stress, abuse, I do believe that there is always a light. I can just speak from my own experience, but I do know that God's out there and He loves us and He created us, and He is whatever you're going through, He's gonna get you through. And I'm so grateful I had that inside of me, that tenacity to keep going. And all I can say is, if you feel down and discouraged, and this is an example, I'm doing some edits to my book, and yesterday, just a friend of mine, a fellow writer, sent me a message and said, "Jo, I just felt like I needed to encourage you today. Hang in there, you got this." And I sent her a message back, "How did you know?" So just God is always there. And I think if we just reach for Him and just say, "Let me be the vessel for you, you direct me, you be my pilot," amazing things can happen.
And genuinely giving it to the Lord. And that's what you've done. It's not, because so many times, and I do this too. It's like, okay, Lord, you got this.
Yeah, but do you really mean it?
Do you really mean it? And most of the time, I don't really mean it, because I hold on to it. And just seeing the tenacity and the faith to honestly do that. And speaking of faith, when you and Matt were married and had the kids, and I mean, y'all are in Dallas and you have your business and everything's going, in the book, it also states too that you kind of church hopped for a little bit. That you really didn't feel at home. You really, tell me about that.
Well, and June Hunt, who does a class for us at our church on Sunday nights, and she has the Hope Center, and she is a counselor, a grief trauma counselor. She is amazing. But she brought up something in one of her classes I went to about 5 years ago about spiritual abuse. I never saw my childhood that was going on as well. And so I had a very tainted picture of really what the church is, what community is. I was very angry that no one in that church rescued me or my brother or sister. So that was through this class. I'm like, wow, that is such a thing. And so I did church hop. I did not feel good enough, and I did not feel I could trust, because the people I trusted let me down growing up in church. In high school, nobody knew what to say. It was the elephant in the living room. And I could have had somebody say, "What can I pray for you today? Jo, what do you need? How can I help you?" nobody was really the hands and feet of Jesus, which I needed. And fortunately now, schools, churches, they have support groups and programs, and you can go to people openly. If you have a problem, this door is open. But back then, there wasn't an opportunity. And maybe if I had, I would have gotten in trouble, or thought I'm going to get in trouble if I say anything, or
You got in trouble when you accepted Jesus without Grandma Maud.
I know. And then when going to church, we had to stay quiet. So when I got to Dallas, I joined the first church I joined, a Baptist church, a big Baptist church here in Dallas. And I will never forget, and this is the reason that I joined this church, I know, and it was God. Somebody was giving me a message. But this woman, I walked down the aisle. It was before Matt and I got married, and Matt's Catholic. So I walked down the aisle, and I was assigned to this woman who prayed with me and talked to me about where I was. And I told her my husband's Catholic, and she goes, I want to give you some advice. She said, I was married 50 years. My husband passed away, but I nagged him every single day about church, about his walk with the Lord. And she said, and I want to tell you, I regret that every day. And so that gave me, I know that was the Lord saying, Joe, in my time, don't nag your husband. So I applied it to not just church, but I just don't nag him, because what good is that going to do? You can give your opinion on something, but that I was so grateful and I took that away. I was at that church for a couple of years. And then I'd go to other churches, and once I got involved, or they'd ask me questions that might be a little too close for comfort, I'd back off and go visit another church. And basically what it was, I didn't want people to know the true me. I did not feel good enough. I felt invisible. I felt insignificant. And so I church hopped for many years. And it wasn't until I go to First Baptist in Dallas, it wasn't until I went to service for the first time, and I heard a song, No More Night. The choir was singing, and it was just about letting go of the pain. God's got you. Don't suffer anymore. There is suffering, but just you can step out of that. There's no more pain. There's no more grief. There's no more suffering with that relationship with Jesus Christ, because you do have that happily ever after with eternal life. And so it was that song that was a turning point for me. You can trust. Joe, you can trust me. Joe, you can trust. We've got people here that will love you just the way you are. And I felt it. That church may not be right for everybody. That's why there are lots of churches. There are lots of denominations. But I encourage everyone to find that community. We all need a community of believers together. We all need that. So,
well, that was the point for you getting to the church and hearing that song. That's when the Lord, really just spoke to your heart and got you and said, it's time.
Well, and I heard that song and the words of the song, and it was so meaningful. I started crying, and I could not stop crying for 5 days. I literally thought, I'm losing my mind. I'm having a nervous breakdown. So I share about it in the book, but basically I was connected with an amazing psychologist who honestly held my hand and helped me. And it was explained to me that when you're suffering, when you have pain or trauma and you keep it inside, it's got to come out. If it doesn't come out, it's going to come out with depression. It's going to come out with alcoholism or drug addiction or nightmares or just whatever. It's going to come out an unhealthy way. But you've got to get it out. You've got to talk about it. You've got to be open about it. And so I found someone I trusted, and she walked me through. And it took several years for me to be able to open up and share and talk about openly the abuse, especially the sexual abuse. Because even, as an adult, I still could not connect the dots. I knew what happened. But my brain and my heart could not connect. I had to disassociate and separate that. And once I was able to identify it and call it something, give it a name, that's when I was able to heal.
And I think that's so important for just on so many different levels, because especially in the Christian community, like in being a Christian in our faith, sometimes, and I know back then too, you could not talk about things. You could not, it all swept under the rug, and you just dealt with it and sat on the second pew at church and acted like everything was fine. Like you did, and like you talk about in the book. And when you finally were able to do that, and you knew the Lord was calling you to write this book. Because I finished it. It's so good. It's so good.
Thank you.
When I finished it, I just laid on my couch in just tears, because there's so many things that God has just, your whole life, God has had his hand on you. And we all, and what's so encouraging and so uplifting about when I got done with the book, I literally just didn't turn on the TV, didn't turn my music, didn't any of that. I just reflected and I just prayed. And I was like, Lord, all of those circumstances in my own life, just reflecting on things, he reminded me, don't forget, just like I was there with Joe, I'm there for you and everybody else that calls on me. And it was just so encouraging, and all of those, it's just so good. And the whole point to the whole message is that the Lord has brought you through everything and had his blessing. And I really feel like you're ordained to share this, because not everybody can go through the healing process and then be able to commit to putting it on paper and then edit it and then relive all those things, all those numerous times, including now during this podcast. So the fact that you're able to do that is from the Lord to begin with. And just know it's going to be a very, very much an encouragement to people. And I hope you're encouraged in that, because God has his hand on it. And already it's been life-changing for me. But I do want to know, in closing, and then we can pick up on part 4. I was like, I hope there's 10 parts. But on part 4, I really want to know how your parents, how were they with your kids? How were your...
They had very little involvement. And when Amanda was 13, my dad had seen my kids twice. And it was on it was our initiative. We went to Florida. He was living in Florida. And I called him. It was about 2 weeks before Christmas. And I said, Dad, if your grandchildren were lined up in a group of 12 kids, you would not be able to pick them out. And I said, and that is sad. And I said, I know you know how involved grandmother and granddaddy were in our lives, and Honey and Bear. You know what you need to do. And my dad cried and made all kinds of excuses, but he was sincere, and did make a little bit more of an effort. He had no money, but he did start sending cards on birthdays and Christmases. He did make more of an effort. My mother, we saw her at Thanksgiving every year. She'd come to Dallas, never stayed with us. She never babysat. Just wasn't her thing. So it was no different. I'd hoped that it would be different, but it wasn't, which is unfortunate. Changed. No, it didn't change.
Well, and I know that too, your relationship with your parents was still kind of, there was still a strain there after you had kids. It just never really went away. It was just constant. And on the next podcast, what I want to do is just kind of touch on, I really want to go through the end stage of each of your parents' lives and what that looked like, and where you were and all of that. And because that's a whole other source of admiration that I have for you. So stay tuned for that. We will be back with Lemon Tree Part 4. So
And
I'm
it
excited.
is, this was about redemption, but it's about
Totally.
forgiveness too, because that is so crucial in the healing process.
Yes.
So thank you so much, and we'll see you again.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us on the Lemon Tree Memoirs of Courage podcast, hosted by author Joe Alch. You can find more information on Joe's beginnings and the Lemon Tree at thelemontreebook.com.